What's going on, guys? Hyper here with another discussion video, and this will be the last one before we transition over to reviewing all of the melee classes on the BFA beta. I will release a video for each of the specs, and they shouldn't be too long. They will probably be about 5 to 15 minutes long, depending on how much insight I have in the class, because obviously some of the classes I don't really play on live, so I don't have a point of comparison. But I will test all of the talents and show you guys some builds and some changes that they made on the beta. And hopefully this will give you an idea if you're trying to choose a main, or maybe like me, you're trying to choose an alt character to see which one you should go with. There are quite a few topics which we could talk about, but let's take a look at what we should complain about next, which hopefully gets fixed going into the next expansion. And there we have it, mobility. Mobility is one of those talking points which always comes up whenever someone discusses Death Knights. And I avoided talking about mobility in my Frost and my Unholy DK rework because mobility is not something that only those two specs struggle with. We have this issue across all three specs, and in Legion it wasn't all that big of a deal and you could play around it quite well, especially because we had boots and we have Sephuz. And even though in combat we couldn't use those, obviously, because you have to go with damaging legendaries or tanking legendaries, out of combat, DK mobility was a non-issue. But in combat, obviously, even in Legion, we had some issues with this. Before we talk about Death Knight exclusively, I wanted to mention some other classes and their mobility kits. So rogues obviously have sprint and a shadow step for sub and assassination, and grapple for outlaw. Warriors have charge and leap. Monks have tiger's lust, FSK, which is a flying serpent kick, and roll. So this pattern kind of holds up across most of the melee specs, where they either have one gap closer and one movement speed boost, or they have multiple gap closers. And DK is probably one of the only classes that has a really bad mobility tool, which is Racewalk. An argument can be made for Retribution Paladins, but in my opinion, Horse is still better than Racewalk. So let's talk about the issues with Racewalk. First of all, it cancels whenever you attack or cast an ability. Even casting your potion inside Racewalk cancels it. So this is a huge issue. Even though it's only a 3-second cast, or if you spec into it, it's slightly longer. Casting during your mobility boost should be a given, and every single class should be able to do it. It makes no sense that we have to choose between being able to press buttons and moving slightly faster. The second big issue with this is it requires a glyph to even function properly. And this has been a bug in the game ever since Levitate was introduced, where even though your character model is off the ground, you can get caught on things which are on the ground. It makes no sense. If you're levitating, or in this case, wraithwalking, then you want to be able to float over things, right? So you should be, in theory, at least jump animation high. But instead, we get caught on stairs, on corners, on pebbles, on little feathers on the ground, anything that's has even a slight hitbox that's above just flat, you just get caught on it with Wraithwalk. So all the other Wraithwalk glyphs we can't even use because we need to use the one where it actually just makes us walk, so we're able to jump over things for it to even function properly. And that's a huge flaw. This has been a problem since the ability was introduced in its very earliest form. And then a little bit of a memer here. Wraithwalk has a placeholder animation. So this was told to us in a blue post that, you know, the Wraithwalk animation is currently a placeholder, but Wraithwalk has had the same animation ever since it was introduced. Hopefully they fix that going to next expansion and actually give us a real animation for it. The initial answer to DK's complaint about mobility was the introduction of Death's Advance. Now, we had this ability back in Worlds of Draenor, but back then it functioned more like Wraithwalk, where it was just a movement speed boost. So what it does now is that it prevents us from getting knocked back, and it prevents us from being slowed. This, of course, in theory sounds pretty nice, especially in PvP, because if you PvP'd, we've all had experiences where there's a Frost Mage constantly slowing you, and you're actually moving at 1% movement speed towards them and never catching up. So in theory, we press Death's Advance, we can't be slowed, and we're able to just move normally. But in PvE, this becomes a very niche ability. I did notice that in Mythic Plus dungeons, quite a few bosses and trash mobs have abilities which push you back. So it seems like they designed this ability around knowing that going into dungeons and into Mythic Plus, there will be more mechanics which Death's Advance will negate. But in raiding scenarios, this still doesn't address our core issue, which is just overall movement speed. So talking a little bit about mobility in general and how we're able to deal with it and what it's supposed to feel like on a Death Knight. So in Legion especially and previous expansions, Death Knight was always able to play around the lack of mobility, right? You need to position better because you know that you won't have a charge or a leap or a shadow step or something to get out of a sticky situation. So we need to make smarter positional choices. But making smarter positional choices can really only take you so far. Because, for example, if there's a big AoE that you were not anticipating, or for some reason you weren't paying attention quite properly, and you didn't position the way you were supposed to, you will get extremely punished compared to other classes. So Blizzard said multiple times that Death Knight is supposed to be slow but hard-hitting, right? So it takes you a while to get to your target, but once you get there, you'll wreck them and do extreme damage. This is not a talking point at all. Like, this should not be a thing that they say over and over, because most melee classes are fast and hard-hitting. What does hard-hitting mean? It just means that they do high damage. But if you look at PvE from a balance perspective, all of the classes should do about the same damage if they're in their ideal environment, right? So obviously some classes are better at AoE, some are better at single target. But if you compare two classes which are strong at single target, and they both have 100% uptime on their target, they should do about the same damage. So they can't just buff DKs up to a point where we just do more damage than everyone else. Because that means we'll find ways around this issue of mobility, and we'll just overpower the other melee in situations where we don't have to move. And if you think about mobility, it's not only about the damage increase, right? Being able to take a debuff out of the raid and then get back in one global or two global cooldowns. So for example, on a warrior, you leap out, you charge back in it. That's two global cooldowns. That is a damage increase, but it's not only about the damage increase. It's about how a class feels to play. Charging out or leaping out and charging back in, or on a rogue sprinting out and shadow stepping back in, feels awesome to do. And on a DK, I'll be honest, running debuffs out of the raid is the most annoying thing to do. And this showed especially on Fallen Avatar, where all of the other melee just sprinted out at the last moment and used some sort of mobility gap closer to get back into the boss. While as DKs, we were left running around and wobbling around the platform until we got far enough away so we don't die to the AoE and then have to run back to the target. And that just feels very awful to play. And even with Racewalk, back then when Unholy was stronger, you were able to take that empowered Racewalk where you were a little bit faster and it lasted longer. Overall, it was not that good to play around. And then I already kind of mentioned this, but going into the next expansion, obviously boots and Sephuz are gone, which means that our out of combat movement speed bonus is just down the drain. And boots and Sephuz were the only thing which made blood DK and DK in general good in Mythic Plus out of combat, right? We didn't have movement speed abilities like monks where we can just get around quickly. We didn't have movement speed abilities like rogues. So our only savior in Legion were the boots and Sephuz. And if we're losing that, out of combat, we will be extremely slow in Mythic Plus, and as you've been able to see throughout the expansion, being fast and moving around quickly between trash packs saves a ton of time overall. As always, I'm not just here to complain about things. Here are some solutions which could help us go into the next expansion. As it is right now, Racewalk is a 70% movement speed boost for 3 seconds. If we compare that to Rogue, they have the same amount of movement speed boost, so 70%, but theirs last 8 seconds. And this movement speed difference can really be felt going from one class to another, especially when going from a very high mobility class to a very low mobility class, such as from Monk to DK. So to this end, I suggest that they increase the duration or the effect of Racewalk. If we got an insanely fast speed boost, so over 100%, and it only lasted 3 seconds, I would be completely fine with it. Because most of the time you only need a burst of speed to get from point A to point B for the mechanic you're supposed to do. So if you think about debuffs dropping out of the raid, you can either use your Racewalk to get out at the last moment, or you can move out a little bit earlier and then use your Racewalk to get back into the boss really quickly. And then the second point, which is I think a no-brainer, and this should 100% be implemented, is allow us to cast while Racewalk is active. This does mean that it would need to be changed from being a channeled ability to just being a buff that applies to us, similar to how every other movement speed buff in this game works. And this will allow us to do some damage while we're Racewalking, so it doesn't feel as awful because we're still using globals while we're using our damage boost. And then the third possible solution is a passive out-of-combat movement speed bonus. This could be a simple 15% or 10%, but we need some sort of movement speed bonus out of combat to compensate for losing the Boots and Sephuz combo. That combo made us insanely quick, and with it being gone, obviously I know that we can't just have a 50% passive movement speed cooldown out of combat, but we need some sort of out of combat bonus to compensate for that issue. Those are my main points about DK mobility and how I think it should be addressed going to the next expansion. If you have any ideas on the topic or any talking points, please leave them in the comment section as always. And if you enjoyed the video, please hit the like button and sub to the channel. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you on the next one.